Google stripped Huawei of its Android license. The results were disastrous. By revoking the license, Huawei lost the ability to use Android, which is the primary operating system for its phones. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you. At first, Google thought that this move would hurt Huawei. However, everything happened exactly the opposite. The latest figures show that Google lost a lot of money after taking away the Android license. So why did Google pay such a high price for Huawei's ban? When Apple released its first smartphone, the iPhone, it quickly captured the market because it was the only one that used the iOS operating system. But that soon changed when the Android operating system was introduced. The iOS iPhone had similar features but was much more expensive than Android phones. Statistics graphs made it clear that the trend showed Android's rapid rise in control over iOS. Some people might wonder how Android beats iOS. The reason is that Android wasn't tied to one company like iOS was. Instead, any smartphone business could buy a license to use Android from Google, the parent company, and put it on their phones. It turned into a fight between all Android-based businesses and Apple. But Google didn't realize that its success was not only due to its own work, but also to the work of other companies using Android. If these companies stopped using Android, Android would lose all of its users. In the midst of the technology war between the US and China, Google decided to join in by stripping Huawei of its license. Google didn't know it at the time, but this move was the first step in a series of events that would lead to the end of Google's Android. Huawei was a key player in the creation of the Android system that it is today. In fact, Huawei added more code to the system than Google itself. Huawei's code contributions touched the most important parts of the Android system, resulting in significant changes. Though Huawei phones and other Chinese products impressed users with their great performance and new features, Google quickly picked up on Huawei's genius and made these Chinese optimizations the gold standard for the whole Android environment. Chinese phone makers have come up with ideas such as moving screens and taking screenshots with 3 fingers, which are now beloved by Android users around the world. But Google's unfortunate choice to ban Huawei from using its services has halted that progress. The choice had a big effect and slowed down the rate of Android system updates in a noticeable way. Google and Huawei worked together to make the Android system, and Huawei's efforts drove its development. Without Huawei's help, the Android system would not be able to develop at the same pace. This dependence on Huawei indicates that Google cannot exist without Huawei. However, the reverse statement is not true. Huawei does not need Google. When Google went out of business, it opened the door for Chinese businesses to start making their own customized systems for the Internet of Things and smart wearables. They rejected Google's proposed Android Wear system and went their own way, causing the difference between Android and iOS to become even greater. The smooth integration of iOS attracted more and more customers, which led to a large number of people switching from Android to Apple. This change in the market was good for Apple because it gave iOS a new record high in nearly 20% of the total market share. The tides had turned in favor of Apple, while Android saw a drop of more than 60%, showing that its impact in the smartphone market was decreasing. The situation has changed, and Huawei's Harmony OS has become a very strong competitor. Google's Fuchsia multi-screen system was introduced with great enthusiasm almost 2 years ago, but things have been slow since then. So far, no Android phone company has switched to Fuchsia, and only Google's smart speakers seem to be using it. This lack of growth has led to key employees leaving the company. This shows how important Google's decision to end its partnership with Huawei is. Their actions did not hurt Huawei, but instead accelerated the development of Harmony OS, Huawei's own operating system. Chinese phone makers also took advantage of the chance to change the Android system even more to fit their needs. They were brave enough to turn down Google's Android Wear system and go their own way with wearable gadgets and the Internet of Things. It's important to remember that Huawei didn't do this on purpose. On the contrary, Google's choices and actions had a big impact on Android's recent decline. This is a classic example of self-defeat in the technology business. On the other hand, Huawei has been able to close the gap in smartphone chip development and can now compete on the same level as Apple and Qualcomm. Chinese companies such as SMIC and Shanghai Microelectronics have also made significant strides in chip manufacturing, which puts them in competition with long-established companies. In the history of operating systems, Microsoft's Windows has been the most popular on PCs, while Google's Android and Apple's iOS have been the most popular on cell phones. However, in the past few years, China has been working to encourage people to use their own operating systems for PCs. This has led to the emergence of alternatives such as US and Kylan. Due to bans and regulations imposed by the US on Huawei, Google stripped the company of its right to use the Android operating system. As a result, it became very difficult for Huawei to sell its phones in other countries. But Huawei saw this as a chance and quickly released its own mobile operating systems, HarmonyOS and HMs, as strong options. The market share numbers show what happened when Huawei's license was taken away. Before it was hit with sanctions, Huawei's sales of smartphones were going through the roof, putting pressure on Apple's market share. At that time, about 90% of the market was owned by Android, while only 10% was owned by Apple. But after the US banned Huawei and Google took away its license, Android's share of the market dropped to 71%. On the other hand, Apple's share of the market went from 10 to 27.7%. This means that when Huawei's license was taken away, Apple gained 18% of the market share from Google. If Google had not taken the license from Huawei, Android would have had over 90% market share and Apple less than 10%. However, everything happened exactly the opposite. The situation has changed, and now Huawei's HarmonyOS is a strong competitor. While Google's Android still holds a large market share, the return of Huawei, with its smartphones to overseas markets, and the growth of the HarmonyOS ecosystem showed that the market continues to grow. Clearly, Google is paying for its choice and Apple is making up for the market share lost to Android. As the main force behind Android, Huawei now has the freedom and speed to beat all other smartphone makers. The question comes up, will Google change its mind after losing so much money? Or will it continue to lose money and get caught up in the political rivalry between China and the US? It is also being asked whether Huawei will release its own operating systems such as Android or iOS. Google has not yet said anything about how it will deal with the impact of Huawei's license revocation and changes in the smartphone business. Huawei's future depends on how successfully it can improve its own operating systems, such as HarmonyOS. As China continues to improve its chips and operating systems of its own making, the US and China are becoming increasingly competitive in the technology business. The US has tried to stop China from making progress, but China has quickly changed its plans and focused on improving what it already does. This change in strategy will help China to build a solid base and gradually move towards producing new operating systems. On the other hand, Apple's iOS is developing rapidly and gaining market share as more and more people like the way it looks and works. Less people are switching from Android to iOS, which shows that there's a change in favor of Apple. Analysts are amazed by these changes because a large number of Apple's new users in the past few years were once loyal Android users. In this fascinating story about the smartphone business, the rise of Huawei and Google's choices have changed the landscape. We can't wait to see what the future holds because Chinese technology is so interesting and Apple's iOS is so appealing. The fact that Huawei's market share is growing and that HarmonyOS keeps growing shows that Google's move to ban Huawei has backfired and cost the company a lot of money. Write what you think about it in the comments.